All right, y'all. I would like to introduce our keynote speaker. Yeah, so we got Mr. Chris Sanders. He's an author, he's a trainer, he's a researcher, he's a business owner. He founded Applied Network Defense, which is focused on delivering high quality, accessible information security content. And he's also worked for the Department of Defense, for InGuardian, for Mandiant, and is also the founder and director of the Rural Technology Fund, which is the charity we're supporting this year with all of your ticket sales. So thank you guys very much for buying tickets, because every cent of it goes to the Rural Technology Fund, which is a nonprofit that donates sponsorships and equipment to public schools to really kind of further technical education, and especially in rural areas and impoverished areas that wouldn't be able to get to it otherwise. So we're very excited to be able to support them this year. Chris has authored, give it up. So if you're counting, that's $2,000 from 200 ticket sales. So Chris has authored tons of books and articles and training courses, including Practical Packet Analysis, which is a fantastic read. If you've ever opened Wireshark in your life, if you ever looked at a PCAP, you absolutely need to read this book. It is phenomenal. So again, we're very excited to have him as our keynote, Chris Sanders.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the great introduction. I want to take a moment and thank the organizers of the conference. As a matter of fact, can we have another round of applause for all the organizers and all the great work they've done? It's I never knew just how hard to create one of these conferences and make them successful it was until I haven't done it myself, but until I've been good friends with folks who have done it and seen the stress and the worry and all the work that goes into it. So big thanks to those guys. Now, before we get started, I'm actually going to give away this copy of Practical Packet Analysis. It is signed in hexadecimal, so you have to decode it, but that's half the fun. So I have a trivia question, and it's a sports trivia question. So basically, the first hand I see, I know we're at a computer conference and I'm asking a sports question, so that's kind of tricky. The answer is not University of Kentucky, but go Wildcats. Maybe. And the coach of University of Cincinnati basketball team is, and this is not the question, but is, somebody yell it out, Mick Cronin. I believe, name the school where Mick Cronin really kind of got well known for taking a team to the tournament that didn't deserve to go there. I saw you right there. Murray State University, my alma mater, so you win. Come on down. We kind of wish we could have kept him, but y'all got him. All right, I'm going to move over here now. All right. So does anybody know what movie this is from? Alice in Wonderland. Have any of you seen the cartoon version, this much older version? I think it's around well before I was alive. Most of you have kids. Your kids have probably seen it. And if you haven't seen it, right, the premise is pretty simple. It's this girl, Alice, sees a bunny hopping around. The bunny heads down this rabbit hole. She peers down into the rabbit hole, decides, hey, this could be fun, and hops down the rabbit hole, and then has this really fantastical adventure where she meets the Mad Hatter and the Cheshire Cat, and all kinds of hilarious and interesting things happen. And I want to focus on this scene right here, because I think this scene is particularly interesting, where Alice is peering down the rabbit hole, because this is really the critical point in the story, and it happens really, really early on. She's peering down the rabbit hole, and she has to make a decision. Do I go down the rabbit hole, right? And what made her make that decision? What was the one kind of trait that was in her that made her decide this is something I should do? And you might say stupidity if this is real life and you're going down a real gigantic rabbit hole that could hold any number of evil things. But for our purposes, I think the answer is curiosity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about curiosity today. And I see we have a pretty wide range of ages here, so I assume we have a lot of people who are maybe very new to the field. Some people who are maybe interested in getting into security, and they're not in security quite yet. So we have, I think, a lot of diversity. So this is not a technical talk. I'm not going to talk bits and bytes. I'm going to talk about traits and skills and a little bit of psychology and how that you can utilize that to better better yourself in this field and essentially learn better. Our field is all about learning, learning to get into it, learning while you're in it. Even investigations are the sense of learning what happened, what are a sense of events that occurred. So we're going to talk about those things, and I took the title from the, I don't believe it's in the movie, but it is definitely in the book, is Curiouser and Curiouser. So we're going to talk about curiosity, why it matters, a little bit about how it's made up, how it's comprised, breaking into some different component parts, and we're going to talk about strategies for being more curious, whether that's yourself, because I think that's really the X factor that makes someone good at what they do in security, or if you manage a team, helping make them more curious and facilitating an environment of curiosity. I got a really great introduction from Justin. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about myself. I'm from a little town in western Kentucky called Mayfield. That's actually the town there. That's the whole thing. There's not much. You can't see it. We got our Walmart back there, and there's a few traffic lights, and there's a McDonald's, and all those things you'd expect to see in the far western end of Kentucky. I do run a company called Applied Network Defense, but I actually want to talk more about the Rural Technology Fund, and I'm just going to spend a couple minutes on this because that's what this conference is supporting. I'm from an incredibly rural area where there wasn't much for me, a kid growing up who was interested in technology and wanted to pursue those jobs. I was very fortunate to be able to have some success at that, thanks to some teachers who really cared about me, but not everybody has that. So I founded the Rural Technology Fund in 2008 to provide educational resources that really get kids interested in computer science and engineering related careers. And for those who are already interested, kind of help foster that and give them an advantage when they go into college or into their career. Really talking about the opportunity that technology jobs presents. It's life-changing. It can end generational poverty. It did for me and my family, and I think it can do that for a lot of other folks. So we donate things from all spectrums, from kindergarten up through high school level, Arduinos, Raspberry Pis. We build entire maker spaces on occasion. Ozobots, little toy robots that you build and code. Kids don't realize they're coding. They think they're playing a game, but they're actually learning about logic and if-then-else statements and things like that. So it's really cool. They're learning about that stuff without even realizing it. So we donate a lot of those things. We do some scholarships, some book donations, and some general advocacy as well. Last year, I'm really proud of this number. We were able to put technology education resources into the hands of 10,000 kids in 30 states, which is super awesome. This year, we're headed to 25,000. That's our goal. We're already halfway there. We're about halfway there. We're 12,000. And so we're, with the contribution of this conference, that's really going to help. And one of the cool things we figured out is for every $2 that is donated to the Rural Technology Fund, that puts technology education resources into the hands of another kid. And we're able to be very efficient with our money because we donate not just to individual students, but to entire classrooms. So we build these resources that are accessible to entire classrooms. So for every $2 donated, that's another kid. So just by virtue of being at this conference, purchasing a ticket, I think there were 200 tickets sold at $100 a piece, so $2,000. I promise there won't be any more math in this thing. $2,000, $2 a piece, 1,000 kids are going to benefit from this concert. So that's pretty awesome, right? Yeah. So thank you. And I always like to show a couple pictures because it's nice for me to talk about this, but when I can show this, these are some of the kids who have received our equipment from across the country. I think we have Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and I think Texas represented in this picture. So a lot of stuff going on. So I like to show those pictures when I can. Okay, to the actual meat of the presentation. And I want to start by talking about why I think this presentation matters. And I want to talk about cognitive crisis. And this is kind of a little bit about our field in general and things I've observed from it from my perspective and through the jobs I've had working both government, public, private sectors, and so on. The benefit of a keynote, it's a little less technical. It's kind of more of a broad, overarching view of things, at least in this case, as I see them, and I think several others may as well. So cognitive crisis, what does that mean? Well, crisis is obviously bad. It's not a good thing. There was a study done by some Kansas State researchers. It's been a few years ago now. There were anthropologists, right? And so they did what they call an ethnographic study. And ethnography is really the study of culture. So they took some anthropologists from Kansas State and they put them in a functional security operations center. God help their souls. These non-computer people had to hang out in the SOC for a while, and if you've ever been in a SOC for a long time, that can be a very interesting experience if you're not used to it. So they went and they spent a lot of time in this SOC, and they learned about the culture. They listened to people, they talked to people, they saw how people did their jobs, and they wrote a really great report about it, and I'll have the report linked here in a second. But they had some really interesting findings, and I think some of the best findings about culture often come from people outside that culture. And so I want to share a couple of those with you here. One of them says that an analyst's job is highly dynamic and requires dealing with constantly evolving threats. So far, so good. Doing the job is more art than science. Ad hoc, on-the-job training for new analysts is the norm. Okay, that's about right from my experience, but listen to this one. The profession of security is so nascent that the how-tos have not been fully realized, even by the people who have the knowledge. The process required to connect the dots is unclear, even to the analysts. So what does that say? Well, it says, sure, we're maybe very good at what we do, but we're not good at telling other people why we're good at what we do, and that's a big problem. Can you imagine going to talk to your doctor and you have to have surgery and you ask him, how are you going to do this surgery? And he's like, I'm just going to open you up and find the bad stuff and take it out. I'll figure it out when I get in there. Not a great strategy. So granted, generally life isn't on the line with some of the things we're doing. In some cases it may be. So it's maybe not a perfect comparison. But we have this sense where in security, most of the knowledge is tacit. It's not written down. Even the people, and we all know them, right? The people who are really, really good at this stuff, they can't really elaborate or explain that. We have a few folks who are maybe really good at teaching those things, but even the things that we're really good at teaching, like intrusion analysis, the concept of connecting the dots, starting with some type of input, investigating it, and determining did something bad happen or not. The process we do that in is very poorly documented, and very few, even really good, really high-level SOCs are good at explaining that. I've worked with and around a lot of SOCs, and most practitioners just cannot simply explain how they do what they do, and that's a problem, and that's entirely limiting to us, because especially if you're new to this field and you want to learn, and someone says the only way for you to learn is to do on-the-job training, so sit and watch me do it, that doesn't work, right? Again, going back to a medical reference, and we're going to make a lot of medical references in this talk, if you want to be a surgeon, you don't start right off the bat just hopping into surgeries, right, or watching other people do surgeries. You do some of that, right? That's important, but you have a whole lot of training that occurs before you're ever cutting into somebody. So same type of thing here. Now, one of the ways this plays out of interest to us is in career progression. So in terms of how we progress, if you want to get into security, how do you do that? Now, in other fields, it's a lot more clear cut. If I ask you, how do you want to get into accounting, right? Pretty straightforward. You go to college, you probably do some type of apprenticeship, you get your CPA license perhaps, and then you go into practice. Very straightforward, most people can identify that path. If you want to be a lawyer, a little more complex, but still pretty straightforward. You go to college, you get into law school, you go to law school, you graduate, you go into some sort of apprenticeship, you pass the bar, and then you are a lawyer and you can practice and do what lawyers do. Even medicine, again, more complicated, but college to medical school, then you go into some type of residency with your specialty. Sometimes you go into a more specialized residency, so you may go from a general surgery residency to a cardiac residency of some sort, and then you're in practice. So all those career progressions are pretty straightforward. Now, I spent a lot of time thinking, okay, what does the standard career progression look like for someone who wants to get into security? And I think I diagrammed it pretty well. So that's where we're at, right? And I host a podcast. It's called Source Code. And what I do in that podcast is I talk to people in this field who I think are generally pretty darn successful. And I basically have them tell me their life story, their source code, their origin story. How did you get into technology? How did you get into computers? What led you into security, and so on. Now, the thing I've learned from that basically is that there's no one path. Everybody takes dramatically different paths. For some people, that's college. For some people, it's not. For some people, it's college, but not in computers. It's in something completely different, right? One of my best friends in the world, he has a physics degree, but he's an excellent security practitioner, although that was not his plan from the start. He just ended up there. So the paths are very, very different. Now, I want to loop that back into this concept of cognitive crisis. And I looked, and we're not really the only field that's experienced some form of cognitive crisis, right? There are others, and medicine is one of those. I want to talk about that in a minute, but I want to talk about ours first. And there are three really factors that I've identified that I think are the things you see that are symptoms of the underlying affliction that is cognitive crisis. One of those is that the demand for expertise greatly outweighs supply. If we have anybody in here who's responsible for hiring people, you probably know this. It's very hard to find people really at all ends of the spectrum. Maybe a little less at the entry level now, but the fact that it's hard to get a job as an entry level person is mostly because we're not good at identifying and finding people at the intermediate and advanced levels. So that creates this kind of tidal wave effect that hurts people trying to get in a job at entry level. Most of the information in the field cannot be trusted or validated. We don't have peer-reviewed journals in our industry, and the ones we do have are 10 years out of date by the time they're published. So most of the information we rely on, where does it exist? Blogs, Twitter, those things are great, but anybody can publish to them, and there's no way to perfectly vet that information. And even information that's good now may not be good a couple years from now, and there's no information police out there kind of purging old information or citing that it is now out of date and no longer relevant, or that theories in it have been debunked and so on. So most of the information out there simply cannot be trusted or validated. And finally, we have an inability to mobilize and tackle big systemic issues. Ransomware, right? That's the big one right now. Many of you may have had to deal with WannaCry recently. We still haven't solved patching. We still haven't solved SMB worms. We still haven't solved ransomware, and these are big things that are affecting everybody. Ransomware presents a good opportunity for our industry to mobilize and figure some things out and formalize some things, but we're not quite there yet. Now, again, these are examples of information security and cognitive crisis, but there are examples of other fields that do this, and I once again want to go back to medicine. And let's think about medicine, not as it is now, but as it was 120 years ago. We think of medicine now, it's really robust. We have a lot of problems with medicine, but they're not really about the study of medicine itself. It's more about insurance and politics and things that are kind of on the side. But as far as medicine goes, it's a really nice science now. We have this concept of evidence-based medicine, where we actually, and this is crazy, we actually have to observe things and have science to prove things before we make decisions about healthcare and so on. We didn't always have that. And think about these three things here. Think about demand for expertise. Well, 100 years ago, most towns didn't have doctors, right? Mayfield, Kentucky didn't have a doctor. You had to travel 20, 30 miles down the road and hope you weren't too sick to not be able to make it there. Not only that, the doctors we did have also happened to be your vets and your dentists and your morticians and all that. Most of the information cannot be trusted or validated until, I think it was maybe 30 years ago, we believed that if you had a stomach ulcer, you should drink milk. Well, we now know you don't do that. That's the exact wrong thing to do, is drink milk when you have a stomach ulcer. It makes it worse. What is the average temperature of the human body? Does anybody know that? 98.6. Did y'all know that's based on a study that's something like 60 or 70 years old, and it used technology that was extremely out of date, and that's not actually the standard temperature for a human body? Most people didn't know that. So my wife is actually a physician. She's a family medicine physician, which is where I get a lot of these medical references. She didn't know that. They don't teach that. But that study was done by a guy who's using a thermometer that was really hard to read. It was about that long. He did it under the armpit as opposed to in the mouth, which is where we know you do it generally now, or rectally. But so the average human body temperature is actually a few tenths of a degree lower. And not only that, it's also a range, and it can fluctuate by as much as a degree at any given point during the day. So evidence-based medicine, we know that's not necessarily true now, although that's not quite yet permeated society yet. And of course, inability to mobilize and tackle big systemic issues. Pick your plague of choice. We have a much better ability to handle things like Ebola now, whereas if we had Ebola as little as 100 years ago, it probably would have been a much more disastrous thing when it got into this country. So medicine went through a lot of the problems we had in terms of cognitive crisis. Now, medicine was able to get through them very slowly but very efficiently, because obviously lives were on the line. And while lives aren't always on the line with what we're doing, sometimes they certainly are now that we have things like critical infrastructure connected to networks. So how do you get out of a cognitive crisis? And I say you do that via cognitive revolution. So I looked back and I looked at other fields. I looked at medicine and biology and physics and law and how they kind of got out of their cognitive crisis. And it's really a three-step process kind of at a high level. It's much more complex than this, but if I had to distill it down to three kind of things, it would be these. So one is to understand the process used in your craft, to practice your craft, that you use to draw conclusions, because that's what we're all in the business in, drawing conclusions, whether that's a medical diagnosis, a legal case, a scientific research discovery, and so on. Developing repeatable techniques and method, and then essentially building training that makes those more teachable, where we're actually teaching people fundamental facts and concepts that they can use to better learn new information, as opposed to just teaching people specific tools and how to do very specific use case things. So it's underlying fundamental knowledge. So I think that's how we get out of that. And I think that's why understanding how we think about things is very important. So that's kind of the basis for the rest of the talk. We're going to talk about curiosity, because I think it's one of those very important things. Now, curiosity has a lot of definitions. I know we think in information security we have too many definitions for the one thing. I could probably start a really fierce debate in here right now if I said, what's the definition of threat hunting? We're not going to do that. But that's not unique to our field as well. In psychology, things you would think are very well defined, like intelligence or curiosity, have dozens of definitions, right? So I don't want to spend too much time delving into various different definitions, but the definition I want you to think of for our purposes today is the desire to know. So that's all curiosity is for all intents and purposes, and as we're going to define it and approach it here, is the desire to know something. And that can be something at a larger scale, like I want to know how to be a programmer, or something at a very specific scale. I have this IDS alert and I want to know whether it's connected to a bad guy, right? So it's simply the desire to know. Now, curiosity comes from a couple different places where we've really been able to gain a deeper understanding of it. The first is developmental psychology. And if you think, many of you probably have kids, and when you think of a small child, a baby, you think about them kind of exploring their world, right? They discover at some point they have hands. And then they want to just look at their hands and touch their fingers and stick their hands in their mouths and do other gross things that babies do, I guess. But they're exploring their world, and that's how they learn. And really learning in a broader sense as adults is really not much more complicated at a fundamental level. We're constantly exploring our world. We're taking in new information, and where we have some type of drive that drives us to continue to do that exploration, and that's generally curiosity. So curiosity is very important from a developmental perspective. Now, the other perspective, which is interesting, is the evolutionary perspective. And I have the gator on the screen here because there's a very prolific psychologist by the name of William James in the early 20th century. And he wrote a lot of great stuff, did a lot of very important things, but in terms of curiosity, one of the kind of epiphanies he had, he was standing on a riverbank, standing just like I'm standing now, and he saw a gator swimming kind of at an angle towards him. It was coming from a distance, and he could tell it was a gator. Gators don't have good eyesight, so the gator probably couldn't tell that he was there, that he was a human. Maybe he had never seen a human, who knows. But it was swimming towards him, and William James, for whatever reason, didn't run, but he was just standing there, and this gator swam towards him, and he's standing looking at it, and then he kind of shifts his weight over. And when he shifts his weight over, that gator sees him and then darts off the other way. Right? He realizes this thing that's standing there is actually alive, and I don't know what it is, and I'm scared of it. So you have this concept of fear. And that's where we really get our understanding of curiosity versus fear, that they are two sides of the same evolutionary coin. Curiosity is what propels us to explore our world, and fear is what is really the check and balance on that. Right? It limits our ability to explore such that there are certain things that we maybe don't need to explore. Right? So the gator is a simplified kind of animal world example, but there are plenty of those in the human world as well. So for our purposes, curiosity is simply the desire to know. And so we're going to talk about how to break that down into subcomponents and some things like that. But I want to talk about curiosity first as it relates to experience. Because I think most people, if you ask them about experience, will say, well, how do you measure experience? Well, okay, I have 5 years experience, 10 years experience, but is years really the best way to measure experience? I mean, let's take this example. Let's say we have Jack and Diane, two American kids living in the heartland, who happen to be security analysts. They, fresh out of college, fresh University of Cincinnati graduates, they get hired into the exact same job. They have the exact same experience in the field. So they get hired in to be security analysts, and then you leave them alone and come back 5 years later, and you find out, well, Diane has far surpassed Jack in ability. All of her superiors say she's just a much better analyst. She's intensely better at her job. But they both have 5 years experience. So what's the difference? Well, I would posit it's curiosity, and that Diane is probably, all things being equal, more curious than Jack, and that allowed her to gain experience at a more favorable rate. Of course, at this point, we're not measuring experience simply by years. We're measuring it by the amount of practical knowledge gained for use in the field, and that's a much better way to understand curiosity as it relates to experience. Now, the thing about curiosity is it changes, right? It goes up and down, but it really affects the rate at which we gain experience. And I have a couple of charts here, and you can see we have time in the job on the bottom there, and then we have the amount of experience measured at the way I discussed a moment ago on the vertical axis. So at the top, we have someone who I would say has very sustained high curiosity. And this is their career progression. They learn at a really fast rate, and they keep doing that. On the bottom, we kind of have the flip side. It's someone with very sustained low curiosity. They're not very curious. They're not taking in a lot of new information. They're not exploring the world within their domain. And so they're not really gaining a lot of useful knowledge, and they just don't end up at the high level of experience that the other person. So you would say perhaps that Diane is at the top here and Jack is at the bottom. And you can see those career arcs as such. Now, these aren't entirely realistic arcs in terms of how curiosity affects our experiences. These are probably a little bit more realistic. In the top one, we have someone who's just getting into their career, and they are very, very curious, and they gain a lot of experience really quick, but then it kind of levels off. And we've all known folks like this. Life happens. You're very career-focused, and then maybe you become more family-focused. You take a new job, and it's not a great job, and it kills your curiosity for a little while. Or you just kind of phone it in. We've known folks like that, too. So this is a waning curiosity. On the bottom, we have kind of the opposite of that, where folks start out with very low curiosity. Maybe they're not in the right field, they're not in the right specialty. Maybe they're on the blue team side and they figure out that the red team is the place for them to be, and then they get on that side, and then curiosity really ramps up, and they start gaining experience at a whole new level. This is also pretty consistent with what we see with folks who choose technology as a second career, when they get really interested in that and the curiosity is absolutely there. Now, in truth, this is also probably not super realistic. It's maybe realistic kind of on a macro scale, but if you look in and maybe we're to zoom into a year of this, curiosity doesn't look like this or it doesn't look like this. It probably looks like this, right? Because again, life happens. We often want to think that our personal life and our professional life are very separate things, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. Everything we do in our personal life psychologically affects our professional life and vice versa. So there's a lot of things that go into that and how curious you are, and we're going to talk about a couple of those here in a second. Now, practically speaking, I see curiosity and experience and the combinations thereof manifest as such. Now, green is obviously good, red is obviously bad, and you'll see the common denominator here is experience doesn't matter in a lot of ways. And if you look on the top right, we have the excels area. These are the people who are your ideal employees. They have a ton of experience and also very curious. And not only do they have that experience, they're continuing to gain it at a really high rate. That's the ideal place to be. But not everybody starts with experience, and that's okay too. So we have that on the top left, and those are the people who are really curious, but they have little experience. The good thing is, because they're so curious, they will gain experience at a much higher rate than others. And these folks are generally jumpy. That's the word I would use. If you're in a SOC environment, they're the folks who everything they see looks malicious and they want to file a ticket on everything. And that's fine. It's not fine if they're working by themselves because they can't figure out, they don't have someone telling them what's good and what's not. You need strong mentorship, and that's the case. And if you are that mentor, it can get really frustrating. But that's okay. That's why you got to have a strong will to be able to do that stuff. So those folks are jumpy, and jumpy is a good thing. Jumpy can be channeled, jumpy can be used. Now, what can't be are people with low curiosity and low experience. Those are your folks who are generally ineffective because not only do they have inexperience, they don't know what is bad and what isn't. They're also not propelled to actually gain that experience at a very quick rate. So those are the folks who are generally ineffective unless you can do something about that curiosity level. And then, of course, on the other side, you have folks who have a ton of experience, but their curiosity has fallen off the map for some reason. Again, the folks who maybe have just kind of phoned it home or have other things going on, and they generally tend to be pretty apathetic about the job. That's the best word I would use to describe folks like that. So generally, you want to be in that top section. You want to be hiring people who are in that top section at an entry level. You want to be hiring people on the top left is my experience. And again, from perspective of someone who's spent a long time hiring people in a SOC environment, curiosity is the number one thing I look for when I'm hiring new folks right out of the field. Now, a lot of people like to talk about passion. You want to hire passionate folks, but generally speaking, I don't expect someone who's never had a job in this field to be passionate about it. I don't think that's entirely realistic. How can you be passionate about a job that maybe you don't fully understand the full scope of? As a manager, I generally believe it's my job to make them passionate about it. And if they're curious, I'm much better able to do that. So let's talk about curiosity and a couple of these subcomponents of it and kind of define it a little bit. There are a lot of theories about curiosity. Obviously, psychology is a field where there are a lot of things we don't know. The mind is generally the most studied thing in human history, but the least understood. We're getting better at that thanks to medical science and MRI devices and things like that. But one of the more predominant theories about how curiosity works, and I think the most subscribed to one, is something called information gap theory. Now, with information gap theory, you really have two components. You have what you know, which we call your knowledge point, and you have what you don't know, which is your reference point. And it's your awareness of what you don't know that presents opportunity for curiosity. That's where this gap comes in. So I know what I know, and I know what I don't know, and there's a gap between those two things. And that creates essentially deprivation, right? Mental deprivation. It creates a little bit of strife, and that I really want to be able to close that gap. Or maybe I do, or maybe I don't. What you're doing is essentially a subconscious gamble. You know what knowledge exists out there, and you think, okay, here's the effort required to gain that knowledge, and here's the value I get out of it. And you make a gamble. And if those two things combined mean it's worth it, you're probably going to pursue that knowledge. If they don't, maybe there's no reward for learning it, there's no career benefit, there's no personal benefit, or maybe it's just simply too much work to learn it, then you're probably not going to pursue it. Right? And this isn't just information security specific, it's really all walks of life. From an investigation standpoint, it means you see a weird packet come across the wire and you think, how long is it going to take me to research this? What's the benefit of doing it? And if all is good, you're going to do it. Chances are, if that's your job, you're probably going to do that more often. If something breaks on your car, your alternator breaks, and you don't know anything about alternators, well, you could probably figure it out, probably figure out how to fix it. But is it worth it to you to spend that effort and go through the pain of gaining that knowledge? And is there a great benefit to it? How often are you going to have to replace an alternator? Maybe not often, maybe it's not worth it. So you have this concept of reward and disappointment. And reward and disappointment are kind of moving targets. A lot of things have very clear rewards, like for our career. A lot of us started out playing video games. Video games are great because they have a very clear reward system. You get achievements along the way. There's a final boss. You beat that. You get the pride of doing what you've done. But there's also the concept of disappointment. And we often do things that, from a curiosity perspective, where we're satiating our curiosity, that we almost never get rewards. And I think of one that applies to me is I work from home, so my office is at home. So one of the bright, shining moments of my day when I get a little bit of sunlight is when I go out to check the mail. Some of you probably work from home, and you probably notice I see a lot of heads shaking on the front row. So I get really excited when the mail comes. My window looks out at the front, and I see the mail truck, and I just scamper out there. And it was very funny when I first got married. My wife came home one day from work, and she brought in the mail. And I was like, what are you doing? Why would you take my joy away? So she doesn't get the mail anymore. But nonetheless, that's the thing, is I get really excited about the mail because there's curiosity. You know, I know the things I know. I don't know what's in that mailbox, and there's that gap there. And I go out and check it every day, very excited. Now, unfortunately, 9 times out of 10 or more, there's nothing exciting in the mailbox. It's bills, it's junk, it's what have you. I don't get a lot of mail, I guess. You can all write me letters, I guess. That'd be great. But I don't get a lot of mail, so that's one of those things where I'm constantly disappointed virtually every day, but I'm still satiating my curiosity, and it's probably because the effort's really low, right? And there's benefits of I get to go outside, get some fresh air, take the dog with me sometimes, et cetera. So it, again, is a two-factor thing. It's the reward that comes with it, as well as the amount of effort, and it's the kind of the interplay between those things. So that's how information gap theory essentially works. Now, there's also an interesting concept of knowing what you don't know. And what we kind of see over the course of the career, especially in fields like ours, where if you've been in it for a while, you know that the amount of knowledge out there is vast and more than you'll ever be able to consume. A lot of people come into this field saying, I want to know everything there is to know about security. And as most of us know, that's virtually impossible because it's such a diversified field, so many different specialties within it. So you kind of get that knowledge as you go along, and this picture kind of represents that, wherein when you start in this field as a novice, your knowledge point, which is what you know, and your reference point, which is the point at which you know exists, is pretty close. You think, okay, I can get there, but then as you go along, those two things diverge pretty quickly. And they don't always diverge in a perfectly straight line. It's not a linear thing. It's often like this. Like you learn, okay, I don't know anything about SQL injection. And then you kind of learn a little bit about it, then you realize there's about 1 billion different ways to do SQL injection, and so your reference point for that goes way up, right? You realize there's a massive amount of things you don't know about that. And it's a lot of those little instances and those topical things when combined that produce an art kind of like this, where when you get to an expert, really oftentimes what expert means is being aware of the things that you don't know, and also being aware of who does know those things so you can point people to them. I used to feel like, to pick on someone in the crowd, I used to feel like I knew a lot about sensors, network sensors. And now I realize there's so much more I don't know. But if there's something I don't know, I point them to Mike Reeves, sitting here in the front row, because he knows more about sensors than anyone. So that's a lot of what being an expert is, although I don't think they teach that in school as much. Expert is often not about knowing things. It's about knowing what you don't know and then pointing to people who do know those things. So we have this concept, again, of the knowledge point and the reference point. Now, I'm going to get back to that, but I want to talk about motivation, because there's obviously a motivational component to curiosity. It's the desire to know, and desire means there's a motivational aspect to that. Now, there's two sides of this. There's generating curiosity in the first place and maintaining it. Now, generating it in the first place is tricky, and that relates to interest. And interest is kind of another field. We're not going to get into that too much, but how do you generate interest in a specific topic? Some people are kind of innately interested in information security. Some people will never be interested in it. I think one of the problems with our field and with computing in general is there's a general perception that you have to be a genius to work on computers for a living, and I am living proof that that is not true. So by setting that, it's almost like an excuse people use. You set the barrier to entry so high, then I can use that as an excuse for not getting into a specific field, that you need to be a genius to do these things. And there are very few fields where you truly have to be a genius to do them, and ours is certainly one of those. So curiosity generally begins with interest. How do people get interested in things? That's a long and complicated thing that we don't honestly know a ton about, so I'm not going to focus on that. What I will say is we're really good at getting people interested in this industry at hacking, breaking, and coding, and really bad at getting people interested in detecting, defending, and writing. which are ironically the things I do more of. So what goes into that? Well, there's a lot. I think generally speaking, when you talk about a red team versus blue team type thing, on a red team side, there's generally a bigger sense of mystery, reward, and measurable success, right? As a red teamer, you have a very clear perspective of generally, here's my objective and here's my mission, and you know when you accomplish it. Whereas on the blue team side, you may spend your entire life preparing for an attack that never comes, and you also have this sense of, am I being attacked right now and I never know it? So it's very hard to measure success. It's very hard to identify rewards for things you're doing, and that is very quickly picked up upon by people, and as a result, it's hard to get people interested in those things. So I think that's where we really have a lot of work to do collectively as an industry, because those are the things that are, I'm not going to say more important, but those are the things we need more people who are skilled and able to do. Now, next I want to talk about maintaining curiosity. I want to spend a little bit more time on this because I think this is important. I think we can do things about this. And we all know this phrase that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And that's great. But here's what they don't tell you, is that the first step is also often the easiest, right? It's the first step out your door, and then you get to the mile 124 of 1,000, you got to climb that big old mountain over there. So maintaining motivation is much harder than starting it in the first place. And go look at a gym on this January 2nd, right? Everybody sets their New Year's resolutions, and they want to go to the gym, and then 3 weeks later, it's a ghost town again. So. Now, where this comes into play is with that gap we talked about, that gap between what you know and what you don't know. And that gap's very important, temporally speaking, in terms of your awareness of it. The gap is all about awareness, and that's where curiosity lives. But there's something kind of negative that happens when you feel like you really know something, then very quickly you realize there's a lot you don't know. When that happens really fast, it can be very detrimental to motivation. And that's something I call rapid gap awareness. And this picture shows that to some degree, wherein when your awareness, which is the red line, goes up really, really fast, your motivation goes down equally as fast. And unfortunately, the only remedy for getting your motivation back up oftentimes is closing the gap. And once you figure out that gap is very large, closing that gap is something that takes a little bit of time. You don't jump out of it, you generally crawl out of it. So this kind of illustrates how curiosity is easy to start but hard to maintain. You get really curious about something, and then you realize you don't know a ton about it. There's so much to learn, and you get really demotivated fast. The area where I think this applies to a lot of people in our field is coding. Most people in information security don't start out as programmers, but they realize eventually that yes, as a security practitioner, it is helpful to be able to write out some Python scripts or something like that. So you say, I'm going to learn Python. And then you write your first little hello world. You're starting to use if-then-else statements, some loops, and then everything's good. Then all of a sudden you learn about object-oriented programming and functions and inheritance, and all these third-party libraries come into play, and you feel like you're doing something right, and someone says, no, you're an idiot, you should have been using this other third-party library, and there's really no right answer. And that's when that knowledge gap, you realize it's much bigger, and that's when you get demotivated, and that's when most people quit. Right? And I saw a lot of heads shaking when I said programming, so I think a lot of people can relate to that. I know I can. I didn't start out as a programmer, and when I wanted to learn specific languages or specific things, very demotivating once you realize how much there is you don't know. So that's this concept of rapid gap awareness, or RGA. Now, the good thing about RGA is I think you can do some things about it, and I want to talk about those, but first I want to talk about when is RGA most likely to hit. So there are certain events and certain things that occur in our daily lives where you're more likely to have these instances where you become rapidly aware of the gap that exists between your knowledge and the knowledge that exists out there. One of those, very straightforward, is when you get a new job. You get a new job, and especially if it's a new role you've not done before, very easy to say that once you get in there, you're going to realize there's a lot you don't know. New projects as well, especially if they're projects outside your normal comfort zone. Training does this. I see a lot of people who come to my training courses or other ones who they feel like, let's say they're doing a malware analysis course. They feel like, they've used some sandboxes. They feel pretty confident that they know a little bit about malware analysis. And then they start the course and somebody starts talking about assembly code and their eyes glaze over, and then the RGA occurs and motivation is not where it should be. Meetings, you see this happen a lot. New hires specifically, when you hire someone who has a knowledge set that you don't have and they come in and they show that very early, this can create a lot of contention, but it's an RGA inducing event usually. And of course that also can lead to some type of competition between people, not just competition between people in the workplace, but also actual competitions. I see this with a lot of people in CTFs, like the one going on here. They go into the competition and they feel really good about it, and then they struggle a little bit and realize, man, there's a lot I don't know about this, and their motivation goes down into the toilet. It's an RGA event. So what topics do I see RGA hit with the most? And I've mentioned a couple of these. General skills, programming, regular expressions. I teach a lot of packet analysis, and I see a lot of people, once they realize how much they don't know about packet analysis, their eyes kind of glaze over as well, and it drops their motivation into the floor. From a defensive perspective, reverse engineering, signature development, Windows log analysis are things that are very big topics. That last one is one that sneaks up on people. You feel like I'm going to learn everything there are about Windows logs, and then you realize that the people who wrote the Windows login system, well, we're live streaming. They may be watching this. Great people over there, but it's very diverse and it changes dramatically between operating systems, and it makes me want to fall over. So, and on the offensive skills side, exploit development, web app pen testing. So you may look at a lot of these things and say, I've really just identified things that are hard in our field, and that's maybe true with some of these things, but they're often as well a lot harder than we make them out to be, just because we get very demotivated once we realize how little there is or how much there is to know that we don't know. So we can do things about that. And that's where I'll get into the final portion of the presentation. The talk was called Curiouser, so I want to talk about how you can become curiouser, which is a real word. So the first thing with being curious, if you want to become better at it, the first logical question is, well, can you measure it in the first place? Right? That's logical. And there's really two types of curiosity, and I've kind of lumped them together. We have this concept of curiosity as a trait. So are you born with a certain degree of curiosity more than other people? And can you measure that? That's called trait curiosity. And there are a bunch of tests out there that measure that. They're all kind of psychometrically valid. They're good tests, but whether they correlate directly to curiosity and how it manifests is a bit of a point of contention amongst the psychological community, as I interpret it. So we can do that, but it's not the best thing. What most psychologists have said, though, is that we have this concept of state curiosity, which is curiosity as it's applied to a particular field or a particular field of study. And we can become better at measuring curiosity in those things and apply it to a specific domain. You just have to have folks willing to do that research and learn more about it, and that's part of the reason I'm here, is trying to figure out how we can better, in our field, measure curiosity. So I've actually had folks take a few of these tests, and I'm currently doing that data analysis, and that's part of my PhD thesis, so more to come on that. But I think we can measure certain aspects of it, but we are not there yet. So we have the ability, we're just not there yet. That said, I don't think we can measure it effectively right now, but I do think we can recognize it. And that's important. If you're able to look at someone and look at how they perform their job and recognize whether they are highly curious or not, that's a good thing. So there's a couple things I've noticed in my time that, and from the literature I've read, where you can notice in people whether they're highly curious individuals or not. So here are a couple things that curious people tend to do. One of those is ask questions, right? I'm really big on question asking, really as a form of learning anything. You want to be able to ask good questions, and being able to ask good questions is a very specific skill that not quite everybody has. So curious people generally ask a lot of questions because they're motivated to close those information gaps. Curious folks often have wandering minds. We've all known folks like this who begin talking about a certain thing or looking into a certain facet of their job, and then all of a sudden they wander here and there. They also pivot rapidly, especially in conversations. And we all know people like this, and we may think they're annoying because you're talking to them about one thing, they latch on to like a tangential thing you said and take it and run with it. So that can be annoying if you're not used to that, but that's generally a sign of just rapid curiosity and an inability to kind of regulate attention between those things. Curious people often either get up too much or don't get up enough, right? So they don't get up enough because they're intensely focused on what they're doing, and they're doing all this pivoting, and they're staying really engaged. But on the flip side, they often get up a lot because they see something that's really interested in them, and they just want to think about it. They want to process it. They're kind of thinking out loud, or not thinking out loud, but kind of walking as they think and doing active thinking. So it's really the extreme of either end, not getting up enough, getting up too much. Curious people also tend to engage in very random discussions. We don't know anybody who does that, I'm sure. I think that's, one thing I will say about our field is I think our field generally attracts people who are more curious about things. So the baseline of curiosity is probably much higher in our field, and I see a lot of this with a lot of people in our field. But also on the flip side, those people often don't engage in any discussions. It's that whole getting up versus not getting up thing. They're generally the folks who oftentimes are very quiet and they're reserved because their mind is just going in a lot of directions, and the ability to regulate that is a little difficult. So again, both ends of the spectrum. So these are a few of the ways that I see that you can recognize curiosity amongst people. And obviously a lot of these are kind of two ends of the spectrum. So getting up, not getting up enough, example. What is the normal amount of getting up? I don't know. Like, that's not been studied. But that's something to, if you look at someone and say, man, they should get up a lot and move around a lot, and like they're walking around thinking or whatever else, maybe just they're insanely curious, and that's a good thing. So the last part is really creating and sustaining curiosity. So how can you create more of it? How can you sustain it better? So I'm going to give a few tips here really quickly on what I've observed that are effective. Number one is understand the rapid onset of those knowledge gaps. We've talked about it today, so all of you are already better equipped to understand it, both in yourself and when you see it in others. So by understanding it, knowing it's there, knowing that your lack of motivation isn't because you're not good enough, that you're not have enough skill, that you're not smart enough, that's not the case. You're just rapidly demotivated because you realize there's a lot to learn. And again, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The first one is the easiest, but by taking those first few hundred steps, you are a little better equipped when you come to over those mountains like we talked about. Number two, and I hit on this earlier, is building fundamental domain knowledge. One of the things, and I was talking with someone about this example the other day, I have a lot of analysts who have come to me and they'll say they have investigation experience and they used a single tool. So they used ArcSight, right? And so they'll say, I am an analyst, I used ArcSight, I know how to do investigations. But then they come to an environment that doesn't have ArcSight and they don't actually know how to do investigations. They actually just know how to use ArcSight. So less learning of specific tools, more learning underlying fundamental domain knowledge, how to ask good questions, how to use evidence, how to pivot between that evidence, learning how to actually do investigations as opposed to just learning the tools that facilitate them. And that will help diminish those RGA level events and help you better process information. Next thing is looking for aha moments. One of the best ways to get out of these gaps created by rapid gap awareness is to be able to make quick leaps in your knowledge. And there's not a lot of those. There's not a lot of aha moments to be found. What I found with packet analysis, which I teach a lot, is the concept of encapsulation of protocols. You teach that very early on, and people are much more likely to get less confused as they get further into the course. When you're looking at packet captures that all have, SMB and TCP and IP and Ethernet all in one packet view, and they want to understand that, well, if you understand encapsulation better, that really helps a lot. So looking for those fundamental nuggets of knowledge that really help people get over the hump. We're not very good at that right now, but we need to become better at it. And those things, I believe, exist in every area in some sense. There are several of them in programming. I'm sure a lot of the college professors, if there are any in the room, have seen the aha look on students' faces when they really get one concept that enables the learning of other concepts. So we're looking for those aha moments. Mentorship is very important, both seeking a mentor and being one. The thing about humans is we're naturally not inclined to be able to see and detect our own biases. By definition, we don't know we're biased most of the time. And really, rapid gap awareness in this is really a bias towards being less motivated. And so we need others to help us realize we're kind of in that rut, in that cycle, and others are a lot better at recognizing that. So you want someone who you can be around, who can recognize that in you, who's not afraid to tell you, hey, don't worry, it's not that you're not good enough to do this, it's just you have this rapid gap awareness and you just need to pick the curiosity back up and kind of work through it and let's do it together. So seeking a mentor if you're newer in this field, or if you're, I think there's a myth that you can be someone with 20 years experience in information security and can't have a mentor, and I think that's false. Everyone needs a mentor, everyone needs to mentor from my perspective. Creating interest is important. The phrase from the literature that they use specifically is that it primes the pump of curiosity. So we don't know a lot about creating interest right now, but I do know that by gamifying things, that's a really great way to do it. One of the great ways people get interested in red teaming is via CTFs, like the one going on in here. You're gamifying the work so they get really interested in it, and then that primes the pump of curiosity, and it's a lot easier to sustain curiosity once that initial interest is created. So creating that interest is an interesting thing, and we're always looking for ways to do that. Next, keep in mind that attention is limited. I've not talked about attention a lot, but generally you can only pay attention to one or two things at once. So for people who are insanely curious, they really tend to wander, right? I talked about they want to pivot from different things. So for people who are curious, you want to satiate that by having multiple work streams available to them. I know I work better this way. I can't have just one single job I do. I need 4 or 5 things so I can spend a couple hours a day doing each one. And I think generally speaking, people who have a higher degree of curiosity need more of those multiple work streams so they can pivot so they don't get bored and they maintain their high level of curiosity. And finally, just learn to recognize underserved curiosity. Again, the things I talked about earlier, people getting up all the time, asking a lot of questions, those things can come off as annoying at first for new people. And it's very easy to dismiss those people, but I think that's where we lose a lot of our best people. So being patient with people, recognizing curiosity, serving it, helping people satiate that curiosity, close those information gaps, I think that goes a dramatically long way towards keeping and developing good people in our field. So last slide, I just want to close, talk a little bit about art versus science. I mentioned that earlier. That was a quote from the Kansas State study, is that our field is really more art and science. And this is something I see people ask a lot. Well, is what we do more art or science? And I generally think that's the wrong question, because I think what we do is neither art nor science. If you get enough people in the room, you can answer any question there is to answer about an information security problem. There's not really any phenomena, so to speak. I think what we do is engineering. And maybe that's a little de-glamorizing for our field, but I don't think it necessarily should be. I think what we do in our field is more akin to a craftsmanship, as it would be with an engineer. It's not art, but there can be an art to it. It's not science, but we can use science to better understand it. Right? We can use science to collect data, form hypotheses, seek out answers, just like some of the science I've applied here with psychology and how we think about thinking, this concept of metacognition, which is just a fancy word that means thinking about thinking. So it is not art or science. I think the right question is not, is what we do art or science? It is, how do I use science to better understand security so it is less art and more craft? So that's really my challenge to everyone here, is just that, is learning how we can better use science to make this less of an art, more direct implicit knowledge, less tacit knowledge, and making this more a better place to learn and a better place that attracts more initial talent and doesn't lose talent when that initial curiosity gap occurs. So that's all I got. I think I got some time for a couple questions, maybe? Yeah. Any questions? Go ahead. Sure. So, and I think that's a great question. The question was, if you didn't hear it, was basically how do you focus curiosity when you're generally curious about a lot of things? And I think that a lot of us can probably relate to that. We probably all have a lot of hobbies. And I think it's really, I don't have a lot of super great practical advice. I do think it really is contingent upon being aware of, it's being aware of the fact that you obviously have limited attention, and you're making this subconscious gamble all the time. Right, the one where you have this information gap, and it's what do I get out of doing it, and what is the effort required? And I think if you frame it that way, and you start approaching things that way, and realize that time and attention are a limited commodity, you don't just pick what seems interesting at the time. When you're going to do a hobby, say, what am I going to get out of this? And it doesn't have to be financial. It doesn't have to be work related. It could just be you get joy out of it. I like to cook barbecue, and I get delicious meat out of that, but also I just enjoy the process. So it's being aware of that subconscious gamble, and then having awareness of it is really half the battle. And then once you're aware of it, you can kind of apply your time accordingly. But you do have to recognize that, yeah, time's the only thing in life you can't get more of, and attention is also fairly limited. Go ahead.
On the topic of rapid gap awareness, there's something that seems just a little too simple about the direct correlation between a big jump up in awareness of complexity of something and demotivation there. Is it really more tied to becoming suddenly aware of something more complex and then not having any idea of how to pursue that knowledge?
Well, sure, yeah, that's definitely a part of it, and it's an oversimplification as I present it here, but that is definitely a facet of it, of rapid gap awareness. For those that didn't hear, is basically there is a factor of not only being aware that knowledge gap exists, but not knowing where to go. Those kind of go hand in hand a lot of the time, especially in our field, like the programming example I used. If most of us have a problem, we're going to try to Google it, but there's so much information out there, and there's so much bad information out there, it becomes really easy to get frustrated, and it creates this effect of not only do you not know the things you don't know where to go to get them, and that actually only just makes it a larger gap, quite honestly, because that's knowledge. It's the knowledge you don't know and the knowledge of not knowing where to go, or just, they're still knowledge, but it's increasing that gap, so absolutely. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you all for the time.